order. Can I welcome you all and thank you for assisting and helping us out with our one-off all-day inquiry into the Fisheries Bill. Just for the record, I think I've seen most of you around this table before, but just who you are, who you represent, and anything by way of a short, with the emphasis being on short introductory statement. And we'll start as traditional from left to right. So that's with you, Mr. Kinnenmouth.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me along this morning. My name is Alex Kinnenmouth. I'm Head of Marine Policy at RSPB Scotland. I'm here on behalf of Scottish Environment Link, which is the forum for Scotland's voluntary environment organisations, comprising around 35 members, with the common goal of creating a more environmentally sustainable Scotland.
Thank you. Mr. Scott.
Good morning. My name is Ryan Scatterty. I'm actually the Managing Director of Thistle Seafoods. We're the largest independent processor in Scotland. We're employing over 500 people. I'm here as part of the Scottish Seafood Association to represent the processing sector. We have in excess of 60 processors represented in our association.
Thank you. Mr. Dees.
Morning, I'm Barry Dees, Chief Executive of the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations, which is the representative body for fishermen in England, Wales, Northern Ireland. We have in our membership vessels that operate in Scottish waters and land into Scottish ports, in the same way that Scottish vessels land into other parts of the UK. Our members are directly affected by the policies that are shaped by the devolution settlement, so there's that kind of angle to it. I'll just put on record that we strongly support the main thrust of the Fisheries Bill, insofar as these are powers that are necessary to manage our fisheries after we've left the EU and the CFP.
Thank you. Mr. Armstrong.
Good morning, Pete. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to be here. Bertie Armstrong, Chief Executive of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, which is the trade association that looks after the catching sector in Scotland. Some 400 or 500 individual fishing businesses, catching by volume and value about 65% of the UK's fish landings and catches. I echo Barry's statement. This bill is essential enabling legislation to allow us to embrace the big fat opportunity that BrExit presents to the fishing industry of the UK. It's the place for principles and enabling legislation. It's not an encyclopedia of UK fishing. We should be wary of overthinking.
Grateful. Okay, just to get things started. What are the opportunities therefore within the Fisheries Bill, and what does it do which cannot be done under the Common Fisheries Policy? And we'll maybe start with you, Mr. Armstrong, with that one.
Yeah. There will be a complete change of governance of the seas around the UK on Brexit. The arrival at a position of sovereignty over who catches what in the seas and how much is caught. That is wholly, absolutely and completely different from the Common Fisheries Policy, where all of EU's waters are regarded as common access, and the split of opportunity is rigidly set, has been for decades now, in a position of extreme disadvantage to us. It was a last-minute affair when we joined the European Economic arrangements as they were in 1975, and we handed over a great big farm, if you like, to amalgamate with the vegetable patches that were brought by the other European nations, and the largesse of the entire area was spread out in the proportion now well known of 60% to our EU friends, 40% for us, which is not like other coastal states, which we will become. Norway in the order of 85%, Iceland in the order of in excess of 95% of fish retained. So there's a complete and utter change in governance and opportunity for the UK fishing industry, and this is the enabling legislation, the essential enabling legislation that will take us away from the CFP arrangements of relative stability, the 60% leaving in others, and common access to our waters.
Thank you. Mr Kinnemouth, what about you? What does this bill offer that the CFP couldn't provide?
Yeah, I think in theory at least, fisheries management across the piece and outside of the CFP could be more flexible, responsive to biological circumstances and change, and could present opportunities where action for the environment could be taken quicker. I think we could all share that view. Notwithstanding that there would still be a great amount of cooperation needed with our neighbours, certainly on the management of shared stocks and the shared environment of the North Atlantic, if you like. That's not to say we should forget all of the progress that has been made under the CFP, which has been considerable over the last 10 years or so in respect of setting targets for restoration of stocks and integrating with wider environmental policy. We shouldn't forget the progress made there, and the fact that the UK and Scotland was leading the charge in a lot of the reforms in the 2013 reforms of the CFP. Those reforms were trying to lift fisheries out of its silo, operating here, and trying to integrate it more with the wider goals that we have for the marine environment to improve the health of the marine environment overall. That's not to say there aren't big issues with implementation that we're all aware of, and so the kind of big targets in there for 2020 with respect to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example, Global Biodiversity Convention, achieving good environmental status for our waters under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive or the UK Marine Strategy Regulations. We're at risk of not meeting those targets simply, and we need to up our game quite considerably to do so. I suppose one area worth highlighting is where common fisheries policy mechanisms have stumbled somewhat is on the area of managing marine protected areas in the offshore zone. These are sites that are designated to protect vulnerable habitats and species, and new powers within this bill do a job of aligning existing powers that Scottish ministers have for the inshore area with the offshore area. So while EU member states can currently set conservation measures within 12 nautical miles, outside requires a joint recommendation to be prepared and adopted under the CFP. And so what we currently have in the offshore zone, around 18 marine protected areas that don't have effective fisheries management in place because those mechanisms have ground to a halt effectively. Despite considerable effort and consultation over the last 3 or 4 years with industry, NGOs and everything. So we sit in a bit of a limbo, and the new powers in the bill could at least streamline that process
just on
in the
that,
future.
I know that your written evidence, you've called on the government to place a legal duty on all public authorities to meet the fisheries objectives outlined in the front of the bill. What difference would that make?
I think at the moment they're presented as objectives that are sort of only there's no duty on authorities to meet those objectives other than through the joint fisheries statement, and that's a bit of a change from the status quo under the CFP. It's quite a loose duty on those objectives, and that's a concern to us. I think having a clear duty on authorities to meet those objectives would provide a really clear set of direction, a clear reference point for decision makers to head towards. And having those has seen progress under the CFP, and so replicating that to the best of our ability should be something we could look at.
I mean, in your view, are they detailed enough to place a sort of a legal duty on public authorities?
I think they are, but there's also enough flexibility for decision making to happen underneath that.
Okay, thank you. We'll go back to the original question when we bring you in with that, Mr. Secretary. I mean, what opportunities are there in the Fisheries Bill compared to what we...
I think this is a useful first step, is what I would class this as. If we look at Scotland's largest food export, it currently is salmon, which is from the aquaculture industry, which we're growing ourselves. Clearly, with the move to taking back control of our own fisheries and who's catching it, and where I say it's a useful first step, I think what we also need to look at as part of a wider step on the Fisheries Bill is an obligation for the landings of this raw material to be made back into Scotland. Currently, quite a large proportion of our fleet are actually landing into Norway, Denmark and various other countries throughout our neighbouring coastal states. So from a processing side, the two things that we are really going to need going forward, firstly, is going to be access to raw material, which if this is handled correctly, we should see an increase in access to raw material. The second part that we do have, and I know it's not part of this bill, but is also going to be access to labour. So that would be my concern with the potential exit from the European Union, and I would ask that our representatives in Westminster do take serious consideration on access to labour. I'm based in the northeast of Scotland. We have been extremely fortunate with the oil industry, but it has meant that we've got very low levels of unemployment. The seafood sector, I think it would be fair to say that seafood processing is not seen as a sexy job, and people would rather be working in an office, potentially working offshore. So we're going to need access to labour. Prior to the expansion of the European Union to include the former Soviet states, we actually had our own sector bill where we could use Ukrainian labour. And all I would ask is that the members in Westminster and in Holyrood do pay due care to this, because we could have all the fish in the world, but if we don't have anybody to process it, we can't do anything with it.
Have you got any concern just about, when we're talking about the possibility and prospect of a no deal, particularly some of the tariff arrangements for the food products which would come from Scotland?
On that, what I would say is that the demand globally for raw material, seafood raw material, has never been higher, and it's only likely to increase. With the growing economies of China, India, Indonesia, so on and so forth, even the US, we are seeing the demand for seafood ever increasing. What I would say is a hard no deal with us crashing out potentially will cause major problems for a number of my members, whereby frozen raw material is not a problem. We can ship that globally around the world. We already do. I'm exporting into Australia, so you don't get much further away from Scotland. But for a large amount of the fresh producers, they are supplying into the European Union. So we are going to have some transitional agreement that would be required. But if we were looking at a 5 to 10 year time frame, I don't think we should be kowtowing to the European Union, to be perfectly honest, because the global markets are out there. The demand, such it's coming from China and everywhere else, means that our raw material is going to be in great demand.
I mean, we just concluded an inquiry into trade and BrExit and the opportunities and challenges there is for Scotland. One of the things that was secured in the way of evidence, which was challenged, but I'd like your view in this, was the view that a number of the processors who are currently based in Scotland may consider moving to the European Union, so they would have friction-free access, tariff-free access to the European market. Is there any substance at all in that view?
I'm not aware of anybody actually actively looking to relocate. I think it's something that we're all keeping our options open, because we need to see what's going to happen. Like I say, at the moment, our biggest problem that we've got as a sector, in the processing sector, is labour.
Okay, thank you.
And if we don't have labour, then we have to look to where the labour actually is going to be.
We might come into some of these issues throughout this session. David, did you want to come in with Mr. Scatterty?
Yeah, I just want to touch on, thank you, Chair, and welcome everyone. Happy New Year to you all, by the way.
Thank you.
I just wanted to touch on the issue of the obligation. There's been lots of suggestions, and certainly in the committee stage of the Fisheries Bill, there was lots of suggestions to impose an obligation to land fish in Scotland or in the UK. And one of the things, I was on the Bill committee, and one of the things I challenged on was, rather than impose... let me ask you the question. Are there examples, certainly from the processing side of things, are there examples that we could take from, say, Iceland and Norway, places where Scottish fishermen choose to land their fish? Are there any lessons we can learn from those locations that we could apply in the UK, in Scotland, that would attract fishermen to land in Scotland, rather than impose?
If you were to have a look at the likes of Norway and Iceland, Norway does impose their...
Very amateurish.
No, it's okay. If you look at Norway, their quotas are tied into the individual coastal towns and villages around the state.
But that doesn't oblige Scottish vessels to land.
That doesn't oblige Scottish vessels, but I'm talking about the Norwegian sector. So if you want some lessons to be taken from Norway, they oblige their boats to land back into Norway, which means that the processing then stays.
I guess my question is, what's attracting? Presumably price is a factor. Or are there any other factors that we can learn from? Maybe to... it's just a discomfort I have, I guess, rather than a government imposition. If there was a more organic way of attracting fishermen to land in their home country, are there any lessons we can learn?
To be perfectly honest, I don't think there is. I think it does need to be government legislation. I think that is the only crude instrument that we have got that would enforce it. And I'm not saying it would need to be an overnight, you must land everything. I think it would need to be phased. The infrastructure, to be perfectly honest, is not there in Scotland at the moment to handle all of the raw material. But equally, I would also come back to the point, the fishermen that we've got at the moment aren't landing everything that they could at the moment. If I go and take haddock, which is the largest whitefish species that we catch in Scotland, last year, off the latest data that I've seen, the boats that landed, they only caught 82% of their available quota. The year before, it was about 90%. So they're not even landing everything there is at the moment. And talking quite crudely, I think they're trying to keep the prices up.
Okay. Well, I will come to you in a minute, Mr. Dees, because I'm interested in you and that original question. I know Mr. Lamont wants to come in.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to follow up with Mr. Scarcity. You were talking about the dangers and the risks associated with crashing out with no deal.
Yes.
And you spoke about, as I understood what you were saying, the current business that you're doing with Australia and China and the opportunity.
For myself, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but other members of our association, it certainly would be a problem because they are supplying fresh raw material into the European Union.
But you're currently doing trade with Australia
We are currently doing
and you
trade.
see that as expanding?
Yes.
Potentially. So the basis of that trade, is that, I mean, they're obviously not part of the EU.
No.
Is that under WTO rules, or how is that trade conducted?
Yeah, it is. It's under existing trade agreements that the European Union has with Australia and everything else. But the majority of it at the moment is under WTO
Yeah,
rules.
fine. Okay,
Thank you. Mr. Dees, the original question. What are we getting out of this new bill that we didn't secure under the Common Fisheries Policy?
Well, setting aside any transition that might apply, the UK would become an independent coastal state, and so the Fisheries Bill gives us the powers to manage access and quotas and to have regulatory autonomy, and those are huge opportunities. The CFP has led us down a number of blind alleys, so the opportunity to manage our fisheries in ways that suit our fleets, I think, is extremely valuable, extremely important goal. In addition to that, building on really what Bertie said, controlling access to who fishes in our waters and linked to that, rebalancing the quota shares would be extremely important to us to reflect the resources that are in UK waters and should be by right access to UK fishermen. The most extreme example of the current distortions it really comes from the English fisheries, from the Channel cod, where our share, the UK share, is 8%, 8-9%, and the French share is 84%. And that's the kind of distortion that arises with the equal access principle and the principle of relative stability. So rebalancing those quotas would deliver fishing opportunities to the UK fleet, greater landings into our markets, and a value that would be used to rebuild our fishing communities, our coastal communities. So we look at this as a huge opportunity.
Thank you for that. Mr. Shepherd, you wanted to come with a supplementary question?
Just had a couple of questions on what Mr. Dees and Mr. Armstrong have been saying so far. I wonder if you can just help me with this. I think you described it as a wonderful opportunity of BrExit. Can you sort of quantify your ambition in that regard? I mean, do you think then with BrExit it means that there'll be a growth in the Scottish fishing industry? Will that be in an order of 10%? Will it double? Will it be a factor of 10? So that's my first question. Have you got any sort of view as to just exactly how much opportunity is here? And then secondly, and related to that, I appreciate you don't like the common fisheries policy, but do you accept that there should be any international agreements on the amount of fish that we can take out of the water within our shores? And if so, what sort of limitation would that have on the ambition that you have?
Sure. Thank you for the question. A very good defining question, if I may say. The UK fisheries first sale at landing, the measure of what's caught, is presently not too far shy of £1 billion, 940.
Speak up a little bit, sir.
940 in 2017's figures. That represents, in very general figures, 40% of the seafood leaving our sovereign area, or what will be our sovereign area. Therefore, there is an obvious opportunity to at least double that. That would put us on the world stage that Ryan described. The world stage is a seafood producing nation. So that's the order of opportunity. There was a study last June by Scottish Government, and there were some figures in that. It was carried out by A.B. Mayer on behalf of Scottish Government, and it estimated that a realistic figure would be an additional 500 million to the Scots industry and 5,000 jobs. So that's the order of potential benefits. There are many challenges here, but the critical path and the overriding issue is the potential for opportunity. And we would like to see that potential embraced by all the governments of the land to place the UK in the proper place for an island state in the middle of some of the best fishing grounds in the world, with sovereignty over those waters, in a position that reflects that. It's simply daft not to.
Can I just ask you...
Sorry, the second part of the question.
Yes, of course. There should, I beg your pardon, a very important part of that. Of course, there should be international regulation. There already is a fairly rigid and working infrastructure of the nations in the Northeast Atlantic, the coastal states, to get together on an annual basis in formalized talks to decide on how much fishing opportunity is taken. That is set, the limits are set by science. There's an annual output from the relevant scientific body, the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas, a neutral scientific body that says that much of that species, that much of that species, that much of that species can be caught. That is the starting point and should not be exceeded. And the coastal states then gather and decide on the management of that level of opportunity. So there's no question of abandoning law and going back to the days of everybody fishes everywhere as hard as they can. That is out of the question. And we would not even dream of supporting anything that has never been offered as a possibility.
Can I just ask, are you now satisfied with the reassurances you've heard from government that control of our fisheries and being an independent coastal state is always will not be compromised by any fear of a future trade agreement with the European Union? I know this is we've heard the remarks from President Macron from France, for example, who's insisting that this will be part of it. What's your view and feelings about where we are with that just now?
We are shoulder to shoulder with careful nervousness about this. There has not been a time in the last 5 decades when fishing has had a higher profile. I mean, that's a fact. There isn't, because people, the general public, regard this as the right thing to do. To cut a long story short, that's what our polling shows. The old financial adage, past performance is no guarantee of future outcome, because it was sold down the pick a cliche, sold down the river.
It was expendable, wasn't it? It was a term that was used in the 1970s.
Because that happened 45 years ago, there's no reason why that should necessarily happen again. But we note that as an example, and we're nervous. Now, we've managed to have specific statements from the Prime Minister, from Michael Gove, and others, like the Secretary of State for Scotland, but from those two principles in the decision-making process, that we will be a sovereign nation, we will take back control, and we will have a fairer distribution of opportunity. Neither of us are complacent in any shape or form, and we're watching this like a hawk, quite frankly. And we would wish to apply the maximum pressure to all the governments of the land to play fair by fishing.
Now, we'll come back. I know you want, if it's a brief contribution, because we will come back to this later on.
It would be difficult to obtain more and higher level commitments to the UK as an independent coastal state, with all that follows from, as Bertie says, the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, Fisheries, the Secretary of State, Fisheries Minister, all the way down. We're not unaware of what the EU are saying, which is that they would make a trade deal contingent on the status quo on access arrangements and the existing quota shares. That's a battle for the future, and we're understandably nervous that we would have a repeat of what happened in 1973. But as Bertie says, political profile of fishing is extremely high, and there would be a very heavy political cost to what would be seen by the fishing industry as a betrayal.
Okay, well, that's helpful. Yes, I just got... Oh, Deidre, yes, and then David, then we're going to have to move on.
Of course. And yet the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs visited Denmark, I think it was, last year, and spoke to the leaders of the Danish industry and guaranteed them continued access to UK waters after Brexit. And the UK Embassy in Spain was also assuring Spanish trawlers earlier, or late sort of last year, I think it was, that access to UK waters was guaranteed for them as well. I wonder what your thoughts were when you heard those comments.
I don't think there's a contradiction there. I think if I answer two questions. One, international cooperation on managing joint stocks is a legal obligation under UN law of the sea, so that will continue. But allowing access to fish in UK waters under our conditions is very different from the equal access principles. And the status quo on quotas is very much linked to access. I think the model that we should look at, and preface this by saying that not everything that happens in Norway is relevant to our fisheries, but there's a model there of an independent coastal state who acts as an independent party in international negotiations. The quota shares are determined not by historical access, but by an assessment, a scientific assessment of what resources are in each other's waters, the principle of zonal attachment. Indeed. So, and it's important that the EU accepts that in relation to Norway. It currently accepts that in relation to Norway. So there's a useful model, I think, both in terms of cooperation with the countries that we share stocks with, yes, but also how access and quota shares would work out in the future.
Surely that's not entirely the sort of taking back control that was envisaged in the run-up to Brexit. I don't think this was made entirely clear, was it, to voters and to the fishing industry
I think
generally?
Most reasonable people within the fishing industry never had the view that all foreign vessels would be excluded from EU waters. It's about changing the basis on which access would be permitted and using that as leverage to secure fairer shares, more balanced shares in terms of quotas.
Can I just start with this very short? But I spoke personally to Michael Gove immediately after that set of news reports, and it was a distortion of what he said. First of all, he didn't meet the Danish fishermen. He had a round table at which the fishermen were present, and he made an assurance exactly along the lines that that Barry has described. So that's very distant from promising the Danish fishermen that everything will be the same. They're very nervous. They catch half their fish in our waters, and things will, for them, will change. It just will. That's the way that international governance works. So we don't think there's any great cracks in the facade at this point in history, but we're watching.
David, quickly.
Yeah, really quickly. We've kind of moved on from the question I wanted to ask. I wanted to follow up on what Mr. Shepherd said. A very good question, as you pointed out, Mr. Armstrong, about the ongoing international relationships and how we manage sustainability in particular. Could you just confirm, just as a matter of record, that obviously within the CFP we're part of a larger group, but these ongoing the ongoing mechanism for managing that sustainability will continue, not just as part of the EU, but part of that wider North East Atlantic area. It's not a function of being in the CFP.
Absolutely. No, the sustainability objective is embraced by all the coastal states. We visited immediately, both of us did, Norway and Iceland after the decision was taken in the referendum, and we found there that front and centre in those countries' policies of fishing is the matter of sustainability, and that would be what we would wish to sustain. I would agree with Alex's point that the outside the CFP we will be more reactive. The problem with CFP is co-decision. 750 MEPs, half of whom don't have a coastline, and 27 fisheries ministers, ditto, that don't have a coastline, and they have to agree on everything. So it's moribund. You can't make regulation in any sensible way out of that process. So we can do it much better ourselves, and it will be front and centre. It absolutely will be, because there's plain self-interest for the catching industry of the land in not abusing your own resource.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on that question, David, I already mentioned some of the global goals that we have that are enshrined and that the UK and Scottish governments are kind of bound by, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals does have a clear objective in there to fish towards the marine maximum sustainable yield objective. That's also enshrined in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The overall size of the pie, if you like, is, as Barty said, should be set by independent science at that level to achieve that MSY objective, and that's the internationally accepted approach. We have that enshrined in the CFP. We should absolutely match that ambition outside the CFP.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
John Larrett.
Thank you, Chairman. Under the terms of the bill, the UK Government and the devolved administrations are required to publish a joint fisheries statement outlining how they will achieve the fisheries objectives. I just wondered how you thought, in the event of disagreement between the Scottish Government and the UK Government on that, how you think that type of dispute should be resolved.
Come on, let's just quickly. Why not? Go for it. I think the first thing is we should hope to avoid dispute. Let's not kind of prejudge that dispute, is inevitable. But of course, there is always some scope for dispute, and there's lots of recent examples of that. So that to be honest, I think that when that dispute leads to inaction or poor environmental outcomes for us, that would be a huge problem. I think looking at the bill and the way it's framed, one of the safeguards in the bill is that joint fisheries statement has to be produced by a date, before January 2021. So governments are at least accountable to that target. If they don't, it's outside the law as it stands. But I think there's a wider issue here about dispute and the functioning across the four governments of the UK. And that fisheries is just one component of that, really. So I think there probably does need to be a real new approach to these quadrilateral agreements. Quite a few of them are required, including fisheries. And the RSPB and WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, commissioned the Institute for Government last year to look at this issue across fisheries, agriculture and the environment, and really recommended that the whole issue around the Joint Ministerial Council needs completely refreshed. It needs to relook at that entirely. We need a new terms of reference, guiding principles around those relations. Transparency, accountability, all needs to be part of that. And what they also recommended is that for some issues, and fisheries might fall into this bracket, is that you need to take it out of that politically charged forum into a more technical disagreements might be better dealt with a subgroup of Joint Ministerial Council, for example. But as I say, this is quite a bigger issue, but fisheries is a clear example of where we need to address that joint working, but it's one of a number, and looking at the Joint Ministerial Council and how it operates is one way of looking at it.
Okay. Sorry, just want
transmission on that. Yeah. Another very good question. Just to be clear, the areas for potential dispute are perhaps less than might be originally imagined, as long as there's political goodwill from all those participating in good fisheries management and not straying into other political areas. There are two levels of fisheries management. One is devolved, and that is the practical day-to-day management of fisheries licensing and control. And that's fine, and that won't change and shouldn't change, and all is done. International negotiations, the ones we've been discussing at coastal state level, by necessity must be led by priorities set for the whole UK for no other reason than the heft given by the size of our area in the Northeast Atlantic makes us a very serious threat. So we shouldn't start separating that up and causing problems. In those two areas, as long as there's political goodwill, we wouldn't see the necessity for much dispute.
Okay.
Our experience is that the devolution settlement does indeed make fisheries policy and fisheries management a lot more complex. In terms of the Fisheries Concordat, a lot was held together by creative ambiguities in order to get a consensus. And when those creative ambiguities meet the real world, especially in the absence of political goodwill, it causes difficulties. And those are the contexts in which we think there should be some kind of dispute mechanism, and we would be very interested in your views on the parliamentary view of what shape that should take.
Okay, so following on the need for goodwill between our different governments, the SFF have described this Fisheries Bill as being a necessary piece of legislation, but yet the Scottish Government have indicated they're going to try and withhold legislative consent. I just wondered what the practical impact will be from a fishing industry's perspective if the Scottish Government tries to block this bill applying in Scotland.
We think the overriding issue here is this opportunity, and are very foot-stampingly frustrated about the lack of embrace of the opportunity. This will need government assistance from all the governments of the land, and particularly of our northern land, to make this work, to grab this opportunity by the throat, meet Ryan and the rest of the processing industry's needs, expand into new markets, and be creative. When somebody's catching a langoustine and shipping it chilled to Madrid, he's got a 600-mile truck journey and a ferry in the middle of it. The elevation of the UK to the status of a real world player in the global stage might mean that one day you would have, hopefully not too far away, a frozen and chilled hub in Prestwick, where he would have a 200-mile or less journey to get his frozen product to the best market that's available for it elsewhere. And let's not look downwards and backwards and into what separates us, and for goodness sake, grasp the opportunity that confronts us. Scotland is by necessity going to be the biggest winner. I don't mean that in any pejorative or combative way, it's just a fact. When the industry contracted over the last 50 years and rationalised, it rationalised north for obvious reasons: geographical proximity to the grounds, and history, and a willingness to continue to invest. That'll continue. And Scotland, rather than trying to protect Scotland's interests, recognise that Scotland will be the major winner, and let's get on with it.
So for clarity, you want the Scottish Parliament to give to consent to this bill?
What we do not wish to, yes,
Right.
and what we do not wish to recreate is the CFP, two-part distant process where you have to have people in different places agreeing to the same thing. It all boils down in the end to political goodwill. That's the thing, with making sure that fishing does not become some sort of bargaining device, but is taken on its own merits as a big fat Scottish opportunity, big fat UK opportunity.
If I could just come in on that, the Scottish Government has come out with a number of pledges to make the food and drink sector, a global champion for Scotland. We've got a number of things in Scotland that we should be very proud of, from our whisky industry, salmon industry, to shortbread. The list is almost endless. We have got world-class producers, and there has been an awful lot of ambition that's been set out. What I would urge the Scottish Government is to back it up with action and to support this Fisheries Bill in the first instance, because the Fisheries Bill here, this should be a first step in a road to getting us back to the true place where we should be for our seafood sector, both in the catching sector and in the processing sector.
I think the bottom line is that the UK, as it leaves the EU and the CFP, UK ministers need to have the powers to engage in international negotiations, set quotas and control access. That's the core of the bill. And for that reason, unless we're to leave a vacuum, it's extremely important that all parties support it.
Thank you.
Just very quickly, wherever there is a certain amount of legislation that is required to be functioning, when we need to be functioning, whenever that might be, whether that's through the Westminster Bill or a Scottish Parliament Bill, don't have a position on that. What we do have at the moment, which is concerning, is there's a bit of a vacuum of what is the direction from the Scottish Government. There's a bit of a policy vacuum. There has been, I understand, some good collaboration on this Westminster Bill from the Scottish Government officials, and that's all to be welcomed, but with no real sense of direction. Where is the Scottish Government headed in terms of future Scottish fisheries policy? They've promised a discussion paper. That would be really welcome. There needs to be some dialogue on it and a long-term plan that may result in primary legislation in Scotland, but we need to get our skates on.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Did you,
I just want to ask about the withdrawal agreement as it stands at the moment. I participated in a debate on fishing late last year in Westminster Hall, and your name was mentioned, Mr. Armstrong, by Mrs. Cheryl Murray, who led that debate. And it was suggested by another member in that debate that you had come out in support of the withdrawal agreement, but only in as much as it gets us to the next phase. And Mrs. Murray very firmly disagreed with that. And she said, having spoken with you herself, I know he has not said that he respects the withdrawal agreement completely. I just wondered, what are the elements of the withdrawal agreement that you just have problems with, where you think things could be improved? Give us your thoughts on that.
Sure. I have conversations with every MP that will listen with the coastal constituency, and with in that conversation with Cheryl, which was in the early stages. What had been discussed was our distaste with the inclusion of fisheries in the implementation period.
Yes.
That was something we felt very strongly was not actually required. There are other industries that certainly do require an implementation period, but for fishing, that is not required, because there already is a functioning framework that we can just slot into as a coastal state and carry on. There'd be a need for a bridge of some sort, 9 months from BrExit Day up till the first set of negotiations when we are actually a coastal state to start. So that was the substance of the disagreement. I was not saying anything other. None of these arrangements are going to be perfect. The whole withdrawal arrangement hasn't crossed any. I would characterise it hasn't crossed any red lines. It hasn't given anything away. It hasn't made any promises that we simply can't live with. But that's not to say that in the future negotiations there isn't danger. that
because it's been parked really for the moment, hasn't it? The whole issue of fishing's been parked.
The whole issue's been parked, but you could imagine a circumstance where we could have had pejorative action taken against us, or promises could have been made, as Denmark would dearly adore, because of their input to UK fishing, or fishing in UK waters. And that has not happened.
I know you're keen to come into these, but we've only got half an hour left before we have the Cabinet Secretary, so let me try and move things along. I know Mr Shepherd wants to come with a supplementary, then we will try and move through rapidly with the rest of the questions. And if people are asking questions, they can maybe identify which of the panellists would like to respond. Mr Shepherd.
So, well, I guess it's to Mr Armstrong again, because it's to do with this question of goodwill and relationships between governments. You guys saying that the Scottish Government should back the Fisheries Bill. Who could possibly disagree, sort of thing? So, I mean, what I wanted to ask Mr Armstrong is that from the perspective of the Scottish fleet, yes, I presume that there are two aspects of the CFP that you're concerned with. One is that the structural limitations, the principles in which it's set up, mitigate against the interests of your members. I presume.
Absolutely right, yes.
But then also within those limitations, presumably, there is a question about how effective the advocacy by the UK government has been in terms of the Scottish fleet. Have you any concerns about that, or do you think it's been as good as it possibly could be?
Nothing's ever as good as it possibly could be. Another fine question. We always find ourselves at the December Council, the last of which in the old form we've now got through for disagreements, but we do not see a serial ignoring of Scottish rights because of simply of the volume and impact of Scottish fishing. There's the best part of a quarter of a million tonnes of mackerel caught entirely by the Scots fleet. That's a geographical fact, or almost entirely by the Scots fleet. The Scots voice leads. None of that's been sold away or bargained. So everything in the garden is not ever completely rosy, but we do not see ourselves serially disadvantaged. That's emphasised by the actual outturn of 65% by volume and value.
Thank you. Ross Thompson.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr Armstrong, as you said at the very beginning of the evidence session, under the CFP as it stands, EU vessels currently have equal access to UK waters. You said that proportion is 60-40, and that's why EU vessels have benefited so much more from access to UK waters compared to our own fishermen. And by coming out of the CFP and ending that automatic access, there will be a new UK scheme for licensing. And because of devolution, there will also be a licensing scheme managed by the Scottish Government. So my question is, how has the Scottish fishing sector responded to the proposed licensing scheme for foreign vessels in the bill, which will require them to have a licence to fish in each devolved nation?
Yes. The Scottish industry, as Barry mentioned earlier, the whole UK industry recognises the fact that this is not the creation of a wall in the sea, a Mexican wall around the UK, where you don't get anybody inside. There will be access, but it'll be under new arrangements, which is, frankly, the UK putting the management and access to its own natural capital, its own seafood resource in the sea, first. There'll be a number of good things that come from that. So we're relatively relaxed about the process in the bill for licensing, but we're certainly aware of the fact that it needs to be managed somewhere, and managed in Scotland is fine as long as the whole system across the entire UK works properly.
And this is a bit of a broader question, but do you believe that the UK currently has the enforcement capacity to control access to the UK exclusive economic zone to ensure that foreign vessels only fish in the zones which they have a licence for?
No. In a word, no. There is some expansion of capacity required there for sure. I would note with some grateful that fisheries compliance has taken many steps towards becoming electronic. Vessel monitoring system on everything over 15 metres, and plans to put it into smaller vessels as well. That would mean that an EU vessel, a Dane, a French, or Dutch vessel, would be trackable in the UK waters, and if it were proven to be outside the rules, then that would be de facto IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. And the EU has led the world in a charge against EU fishing, so it would be a rum old do if EU nations started IUU fishing in the UK's waters. So there's some pressure there, but the real answer to your question is there's some expansion required there, for absolutely sure.
I think it's important to recognise that member states already have responsibility for enforcement in their waters. So, we're not starting from scratch, and although, as Bertie says, there might be some need for upgrade, we're not starting with a blank piece of paper.
Thank you. David Duckett.
Thank you, Chair. We've kind of touched on the subject earlier about the potential or the fear or some people would report that it's already happened, which, as you said earlier, Mr. Armstrong, no red lines have been crossed. That was in terms of the withdrawal agreement. But we're here talking specifically about the Fisheries Bill, but of course we can't really talk about fishing without talking about the future arrangements. But given that the Fisheries Bill explicitly seeks to end automatic access rights for EU vessels, is the text on fisheries in the political declaration on the future relationship with the EU compatible with the bill, or vice versa? Is it compatible with the UK's government's continued stated position that trade and access will not be conflated? And is it also compatible with your vision for the future of the fishing sector?
Yes. The words in the withdrawal agreement are constructively ambiguous to the extent that was part of a negotiation, and we walked away, and you can interpret it that there is or is not a trade link. We've received personal assurances that there will be no trade link. It is sensible to look at other places or other areas, for example. So the linking of trade to access to your to your own natural capital is absurd. We do not say to the French and the Portuguese and the Italian wine industry, you want to sell it in Sainsbury's, okay, you're going to have to let me have some of your grapes for nothing. I will need an access to your natural capital. I mean, that's absurd. And as we pointed out in the discussion with Ryan, at the other end of our exports is an EU business waiting for that raw material. So it cuts both ways. I'm a little more relaxed than having seen the words in the withdrawal agreement and the Fisheries Bill that trade and access will not be mixed. There's no mechanism for doing it, and no other area does it, because there's all that Danish bacon, there's German cars, there's French agricultural products, Spanish agricultural products, all of it coming into the UK. As soon as you start engaging in a trade war for one specific purpose, there's a live example running on the world stage right now about that is, there's more to that than meets the eye. So I'm reasonably relaxed.
And just as a follow-up to that, we talked earlier about promises being broken. I mean, again, it's a lot of language has been used. It's going to be maybe quite vague. Some things maybe read as a promise that wasn't really a promise. But is it not the case, actually, that at the start of negotiations on the EU side, EU fishing nations were told that there would not be a withdrawal agreement without that guaranteed access? And as actually we're at a position now, or we're potentially at a position now where we could have a withdrawal agreement that doesn't guarantee EU continued automatic access. And What would you say on how those EU nations, fishing nations in particular, have responded to the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration? And what does that tell you? What should that tell us about the political declaration?
We have watched with some care what our colleagues in the European fishing industries have been doing over this, and they have always approached this right from the start, and they formed a well-financed coalition of the European fishing nations that have relevance to this matter. And their starting position was that we aim to achieve the status quo, to continue fishing in UK waters with that much opportunity, the opportunity we presently agree. That is what you will hear from their output. That is what you will hear supported. And if anybody's in a bit of a political corner, like Mr. Macron happens to be just at the minute and was more severely a few weeks ago, then you'd expect him to make statements that were political in nature rather than realistic for an outcome. We will move to a place where the law is different. We're under UNCLOS. We have sovereignty over our own natural resource. To trade it away now, I repeat, would be an act of folly, and I can't see why Mr. Shepherd mentioned the benefits are obvious. Why would you do that?
I'm just very conscious of time, if that's okay, David. Jed Killen.
Thank you, Chair. Is there a tension between the government's commitment that UK fishers get a greater share of fishing opportunities than inside the common fisheries policy, and the Bill's objective to base fisheries management policy on the best scientific advice available, given the reports, I think, from the Pew Trust in 2018 that under the CFP 44% of quotas were set higher than published advice?
Yeah, that's a common cry. And you can look at tonnages and say you haven't stuck to the advice. In fact, there's more to that than we say. I and Alex and I continually have this conversation. The scientific advice is followed. It's given in ranges rather than specific tonnages, and you exceed it by one thing.
We'll to you from Mr. Kinnamuth, particularly on that one, and then with Mr. Gatterty.
Well, perhaps based on that, then the question that Jed has asked, I think there might be unintended consequences with that new provision and new clause in the bill. Though my simple reading of that particular clause is it's very loose in its language and quite open to a good deal of discretion. I think most importantly is to something that could be enshrined in the bill is some obligation that during those negotiations that the importance of setting clear sustainability criteria with those other countries is one of the principal considerations. And going back to that issue of independent scientific advice and adhering to that must be kind of the core that runs through those negotiations. And I don't see any great tension between that clause and scientific advice, as long as scientific advice is followed by all. That's as simple as that.
If we look at the IC's advice, and I talked pretty much from my side on a global scale, and pretty much every other fishing nation in the world takes it as part of the recommendation when they set their quota limits for how much they're going to catch. Quite simply, the scientific evidence that makes up the advice is limited. It's based on samples. So my recommendation to go forward in the Fisheries Bill is we need far better data capture. And by that, I mean, excuse me, all of the boats in our that we'd be catching in our waters should be fully monitored, how long they're trawling for, how much they're actually catching, the zones that they're catching in. We should have cameras in every boat to stop the old habits, bad old habits of slipping nets and so on and so forth, and everything to be landed. From that we get far better data. The scientific boats, they purely do just take samples from different spots of where they go around. And that builds up a picture of where they're looking at. And it's been proven through numerous fishing areas throughout the world that they get it wrong. They regularly get it wrong. So to set it purely on what the recommendation from the scientists would be, I think would be wrong, because we're leaving ourselves very open there. Because scientists do get wrong on it.
though you're keen to come to us, you might get an opportunity to respond to that, because we've got a couple of questions. We've only got 5 minutes because we're going to get set up for the Cabinet Secretary coming in. So we've got Deidre Brock and then Hugh Gaffney. Deidre.
Thank you. Given the government's intention to maintain the fixed quota allocation units to distribute allocating quota in the bill, would you describe this, perhaps for you, Mr. Kinmouth, as a missed opportunity for the under 10 metre fleet and for new entrants because of the insistence on maintaining that allocation method?
Certainly could be. What the bill does is well, what's interesting, going back to an earlier question is that the bill sort of fixes Article 17, which deals with allocation in the Common Fisheries Policy, fixes it to work in UK law. It's my understanding that the devolved administrations have chosen not to be part of that clause. So the devolved administration's intentions in terms of future allocations is again one of those things that's unclear. There is certainly an opportunity here to fix Article 17, if you like, a bit further to actually make it do what it was intended to do in the first place. And right across Europe, and UK and Scotland's no different, it's setting allocations primarily on track record and historic, and hasn't really facilitated that shift towards environmental or socially responsible fishing. So there is an opportunity there, and it could be a fix to the bill as it stands, as it applies to England, to redress that and actually force that issue along, because it's really not been applied properly under the CFP. But again, Scottish Government's intentions on that are currently unclear to me.
Well, I think there's going to be consultation with stakeholders quite properly, I think. Anyway, yes, Mr.
Quite simply, yes, I do think it's wrong on what's being proposed at the moment. A useful first step on everything that we can't just flip automatically overnight. From the processing sector, there's certainly been a shift from a number of the fleet to become ever bigger boats, which means ever bigger landings. From the processing side, what we'd like to see is more regular landings spread throughout the year, because it's far easier to run a factory for 52 weeks of the year than it would be to run it for 16 weeks of the year, for example, on some of the more migratory species. So I do think there's an opportunity there that we could have small
supplementary, Christine.
Yeah, just we've touched on a few times around and David brought up again there around processing. At the moment, there's about 25,000 people currently employed in the industry UK-wide, and Bertie Armstrong mentioned at the beginning how much that will hopefully increase as the landings increase. And I just wondered, where there was obviously support from the UK government in the most recent budget for infrastructure in order to help coastal communities rebuild, and I just wondered what further support that you feel is required in order to ensure that we fully can capitalise upon the additional landings when that time comes.
Quite simply, at the moment, from what I have read, the Scottish Government hasn't looked to put anything toward for grant aid. Now, the European model of funding from grants is going to be going when we leave the European Union. At the moment, there's nothing being proposed on what grants we're going to get to be able to invest in premises, machinery, the automation that's going to be required for our industry and everything else. So I would urge both Westminster and the Holyrood governments to step up to the plate and to offer some grant funding to help the expansion of the industry. Quite simply, our European neighbours, they are getting grants anything upwards from 50% to 100% to build new facilities. So we're going to have a very unfair playing field if we don't have a similar commitment from our own governments.
And in what time scale do you require that commitment? Because obviously, time is running on and things.
I think we need a commitment as soon as possible. Certainly a commitment. I'm not talking about numbers, but we need a commitment as soon as possible.
And lastly, Mr. Gaffney.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. How important has the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund been in supporting coastal communities in Scotland? Are you concerned that the bill extends new grant-making powers to the Welsh Government and Northern Ireland Executive, but not the Scottish Government? I suppose, Mr. Armstrong.
It was a matter of applying and inputting into the bill, and it's a mystery to me as to why the Scottish Government capacity to do so is not in the bill, and you might, presumably you'll ask the Cabinet Secretary that in a few minutes' time. I don't know why. It's necessary. Government support to embrace the whole thing is required, and that very much depends on grant funding. But that's not sort of welfare grant funding. This is grant funding to seed a big industry.
In that case, if a new funding scheme is created for Scotland, what should its priorities be then?
Well, it by necessity, processing and infrastructure.
I think it would be fair to say, Bertie and Barry, I'm sure I've got more detail, but the catching sector are investing heavily already in new boats and everything else, and we're going to have a truly world-class fleet. The processing sector at the moment is lagging behind. A large chunk of that is the European funding mechanism they had actually stopped a number of companies such as ourselves from even being able to access the grants because it was extremely restrictive, and a huge amount of the money that was available for the grant to be spent in Scotland has remained unspent because there just isn't the size companies to be able to take it up. So we need to have a sensible framework where companies such as my own and a number of my competitors can actually get access to the grant funding, and we can take, full opportunity. The opportunity is going to be presented to us. We need to make full access of this.
I know Alex went in.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Very, very short point. We mustn't forget the scheme as it stands is the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund. And so it was expanded to not just deliver CFP objectives, but wider maritime policy as well. So that's where marine data, knowledge, implementing marine spatial planning is really important. So it's not just a replacement for the fisheries aspects, it's the wider maritime policy that we need to look at as well. And that's a real risk if we don't replicate that.
Excellent, and we've wrapped up right on time, so we're very grateful to you all for being very concise and helping us out this morning. We'll probably produce a record of this as a note which will be made available to you, but anything else that you feel you could usefully help us with when we continue to look at this, please give any further submissions, and we look forward with great detail the progress of the Fisheries Bill through the House of Commons. I think the next appearance will be at report stage, which isn't yet scheduled, which I'm sure you'll all be very interested in, and if we do revisit this, we'll make sure we get back in touch with you again. But thank you ever so much for your attendance this morning. Order, order.
Meeting is currently suspended.
We welcome you once again, Cabinet Secretary. This is, I think you're our most regular appearer in front of the Scottish Affairs Committee from our friends in the Scottish Government. So thank you very much for helping us out once again in this Fisheries Bill. Just again for our records who you are, we know who you represent, and anything by way of a short introductory statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Well, thank you very much, Convener. I'm joined this morning by Richard MacLeod and Alan Gibb, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to discuss with you and your colleagues the UK Fisheries Bill. The starting point, of course, is that I think we should recall and remember that fisheries management is mainly devolved. It has been for 20 years, and our view is that it must remain so. And I think that's the view that's shared by Mr. Gove and Mr. Eustace too. We were shown the bill, Convener, very late in the day. I think the day before it was laid, we saw the final bill. But I want to say, first of all, that our officials in the UK and Scotland have worked well together, and on my instruction have sought to do so in a constructive and workmanlike fashion. And that has led, the good work done by Mr. Gibb and his colleagues, has led to some improvements in the bill, a fact which has, I believe, been acknowledged by George Eustace, from whom I believe you will hear later. There are, however, still significant concerns this morning about predation of devolved powers in relation to clauses 18 to 20, and that may be something that your members would wish to explore in detail. Some of these matters, Convener, as is always the way in legislation, are somewhat technical of nature, and I will therefore ask officials to contribute, if that's in order, where appropriate, to provide the technical detail in respect of some of these important matters, as is always the case when drafting legislation. But, for example, the Secretary of State, under these sections, may set quotas and effort limits for Scottish stocks with only a consultation requirement. So we have asked, for example, does the UK Secretary of State really intend to start setting quotas for ordinary crab? I imagine, Convener, that if asked, he would say, well, of course not. And if that's the answer, then I would ask, well, why are you taking the powers in this bill to do so? But in conclusion, Convener, I hope that we can use the further stages of this bill to find a way to resolve these issues, and I'm very happy with my colleagues to seek to answer your questions this morning.
And thank you very much for that. And we will indeed get to the questions on clauses 18 to 20. But can I just start with clauses 28 and 29 of the bill, the powers and provisions that extend to Wales and Northern Ireland, but not for the Scottish Government? I mean, can you explain why this is this case, and perhaps help us out if this is something to do with the disagreement over providing the legislative consent motions to the UK Government on Brexit bills?
Well, I'll bring officials in to answer the technical aspects of that in a moment, but I think, you know, the high-level matter I wanted to stress is that fisheries is devolved, and our fundamental approach, as we indicated in writing to Michael Gove on the 4th of December, is that our concerns relate to the legislative consent of the Scottish Parliament being required. There's a genuine difference of view. We respect the view of the UK Government, but we respectfully disagree with it. There's also the principle of the matter being pursued by Michael Russell and the JMC in respect of the Sewell Convention and respect for the Sewell Convention and the unresolved nature of that dispute. Now, that's not for me today, Convener, to go into. You'll be well aware of that. But the fundamental issue is one of consent, that we do not believe that fisheries, which is devolved matter, should be an area where the UK Government takes powers over devolved matters, and that should not be the case. I don't know if my officials want to seek to respond to the direct issue about the separate treatment for Wales and Northern Ireland. Richard?
We have been in regular discussion with UK Government officials on various possible amendments to the bill where appropriate, and we have agreement in principle with them that these powers can be extended to Scotland if agreement between the administrations and further reassurances to address the Scottish Government's particular concerns about breaches of the Sewell Convention can be reached. So we would see the ball as being in the UK Government's court in that respect. If these further reassurances that we are seeking on the Sewell Convention are provided, we would be perfectly happy to work with UK Government counterparts to discuss extending existing powers in the bill or to Scotland or amending aspects of the bill. As I say, the onus is really on the UK Government to respond to the Scottish Government's very clearly stated concerns about the Sewell Convention.
Well, the Minister has said that these powers were offered to the Scottish Government in the drafting of this bill, but were refused. What's your view on that? And could you maybe tell us the sequence of events that led to this being turned down?
In some cases, particularly relating to grant-making powers and funding powers, the Scottish Government already has existing powers through other pieces of primary legislation. So some of the powers that the UK Government are taking, or the Secretary of State is taking through the bill, are powers that the Scottish Government already has through separate means. So it's, I suppose, a case of the rest of the UK catching up with existing powers that the Scottish Government has. Of course, there's certainly benefits in ensuring a consistent approach across the UK where possible. So if there are particular aspects that this bill would knock different administrations out of kilter with each other in terms of powers, it would of course be beneficial to ensure consistency if possible. But as I say, the overarching issue or the overriding issue here is the Sewell Convention, and you can only, I think, take forward some of these further amendments or alterations to the bill if that very significant issue
Thank you.
is addressed.
I'm sure we're going to get into some of the issues just about legislative consent and the Sewell Convention in the course of this exchange. But just lastly from me, can I just ask you as Cabinet Secretary, when you look at this bill, I mean, what do you see as the opportunities that present itself to the Scottish fishing industry? What are perhaps the challenges? And what do you say to the many charges that the Scottish Government just wants to take Scotland back into the common fisheries policy as part of its general view about the European Union? How do you respond to these type of claims?
Well, we already, as Richard has said, have clear legislative power in respect of fisheries, and if it would help, we communicate formally about the various acts, international treaties and acts under which we have these powers. I don't think you would want me to go through a litany of them here today. So we already have the powers. We have experience of exercising devolved powers over fisheries for 20 years and fairly well. We have consistently, as a government, opposed the common fisheries policy, which we believe is inflexible and doesn't recognise the need for proper fisheries management at a local level. And we did, to be fair to ourselves, put forward, I think about 18 months ago, Michael Russell put forward Scotland Our Place in Europe, which allowed an alternative compromise BrExit option, actually, which, although that's not our preferred option, but we did put forward very clear proposals which would have allowed us to exit the common fisheries policy, a point I made from time to time. I don't really want to go into the sort of politics of BrExit, because what I would say in conclusion is that I seek to have a workmanlike relationship with my counterparts in the UK government, particularly Mr Eustace, with whom I've worked in two councils, although he wasn't able to attend the last council in December. And I also am determined to continue to champion the interests of Scotland's fishing, and that's all around our coast, the northeast predominantly, and pelagic and whitefish, but also our shellfish sector, our inshore sector, the west coast. We need to remember that fishing is a range of diverse types of fishing around our coasts with different interests and concerns about how Brexit may impact on them. But at the end of the day, the Fisheries Bill is really just a framework, and therefore it's a framework which enables powers to be exercised. We're confident that we already have the powers, or that we can take action if required to obtain the powers through legislation in due course.
Thank you. I think we'll come back to some of the common framework-related issues, which is central to this bill. But can I bring in Mr. Ross Thompson?
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. In December, as you mentioned earlier, you wrote to the Secretary of State saying officials from both governments were working together on amendments to provide Scottish ministers with equivalent powers. Could you update the committee on what progress has been made since then?
Well, as I say, some progress has been made, Mr Thompson. We were able to persuade the UK government that the draftsmanship of clauses in relation to powers in respect of international quotas were needed to be improved, and that was agreed, and I think George Eustace has acknowledged that. So there has been good interchange between officials. But it remains the case that my letter of the 4th of December to Mr Gove, which I have in front of me, and which set out our position on the bill, as far as I'm aware, we haven't had a formal response, to answer your question, to that letter. That letter set out the various amendments that we seek, and no doubt we'll come on to discuss the substantive topics of some of these in due course. But at a high level, we haven't had a formal response to the letter of 4th of December, but it is work in progress. So I'm hoping, and perhaps the committee is able to play a role here, Mr Thompson, in encouraging appropriate constructive cooperation. I'm hoping that there can be further dialogue in relation to the important matters that we set out in these amendments and believe should still be considered further with a view to improving the UK bill.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. The bill, if left in its current form, would see Scottish fishers at a disadvantage compared to fishers in the rest of the UK. How would you respond to evidence that we've heard this morning that there is a current policy vacuum in Scotland for this catching sector, with no direction from the Scottish Government? What would your response be to that?
Well, I would refute that. Quite the opposite is the case. We have very clear policies regarding sustainable fisheries. We champion the Scottish fishing sector. We always have. We have very clear policies about how these fisheries should be approached. And fundamentally, of course, we need to respect the science. We need to set TACs. We need to fish sustainably. We need to think about future generations. We need to work with the fisheries sector on technical measures. We need to work with communities. We need to ensure that there is proper funding whether through an EMFF or its replacement. We have a whole host of policies, many of which I have had the privilege of pushing through the Scottish Parliament, for example, in pilot schemes for trying out new methods of fisheries, of the use of science and research. So I would, with respect, Mr Thompson, entirely reject the proposition that you put earlier. My job is to make sure that the Scottish interests are promoted at all times, and I seek to do so, I hope, in a constructive way. The letter of the 4th December sets out very clearly some substantive issues. I hope in not a political way at all, actually, but a moderate, reasoned way. And I hope that in the course of the ongoing discussions, that first of all we'll get a response to the letter 4th of December, and secondly we'll make substantive progress in the matters that we raise therein.
You're absolutely right that the interests of Scotland must be put first. Therefore, Cabinet Secretary, do you agree that through Brexit, the Scottish fishing industry is the biggest winner from it?
Well, no, I don't agree with that. And with respect, I don't think we're really here to shoot the breeze about Brexit. So I'm
sure you don't want to talk
about
it.
that. I'll leave that to others. But I'll just make one point.
If I ask a question, it should be answered.
In relation to the proposed deal that the Prime Minister is seeking to persuade yourself and colleagues to support, I'm not sure whether you're supporting it or not, Mr Thompson, but in relation to that bill, in relation to that proposed agreement, there is a clear linkage between access to Scottish fisheries and UK fisheries water and trade and tariffs. And this was a deal on which the Scottish Government were not consulted, and therefore, if there is no deal acceptable to EU members, then they have now managed to secure from the UK Government the extraordinary proposition that there would then be the immediate imposition of tariffs and non-tariff barriers and the exclusion not only of the fisheries sector but also the aquaculture sector from the benefit of the customs union and the backstop agreement. We weren't consulted about that, and with respect, I think that makes the forthcoming negotiations, assuming they go ahead, assuming Brexit goes ahead, which it may not, of course, but it makes the forthcoming negotiations much more challenging. And it's most unfortunate that the Scottish Government were not consulted about that. Had we been, we would of course resisted the inclusion of that particular unfortunate provision in the agreement.
Well, with all due respect, Cabinet Secretary, I understand that you wouldn't want to talk about the politics of Brexit, given the position of the Scottish Government and the party you represent are at odds with the interests of the fishermen in Scotland. But the politics of Brexit is important because it's quite clear that the position of the government round about Brexit has led to this intransience, which means that we cannot get the agreements that are needed to pursue this Fisheries Bill. And to quote the Chief Executive of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, Bertie Armstrong, take this opportunity of Brexit by the throat. If the Scottish Government were to get behind the opportunities, the sea of opportunities that are presented to the Scottish fishermen through Brexit, then actually we'd be seeing ourselves in a much better position. I would put it to you that it's the political intransigence of the Scottish Government rather than showing goodwill, which is why we are where we are.
Well, I'm quite happy to talk about Brexit, but with respect, Convener, I thought the purpose of today's meeting was to discuss the Fisheries Bill.
It is.
And I'm here to do so. But can I just say, just in response to Mr Thompson's extraordinary set of propositions, that sadly what has happened was that before the referendum, the Brexiteers, including Mr Thompson, overpromised, and now they appear to be under-delivering or not delivering at all. And if anyone thinks that the forthcoming negotiations with the EU are going to be made easier by the agreement that Mrs May proposes, which Mr Thompson may or may not support, perhaps he could let us know, then they're being very naive, because the EU fisheries countries will fight tooth and nail to get the best possible deal. And now that path, that objective, has been made much easier by the linkage of access to UK fishery waters and trade, and the threat of the imposition of tariffs not only on fisheries but on aquaculture, which was specifically agreed by the UK government with the EU without the Scottish Government's consent.
Sorry, lastly, just to correct that last bit of unadulterated nonsense, which is that Brexit is not delivering for the fishing industry. I think it's been quite clear from anyone who's involved in the catching sector and the processing sector that Brexit does deliver for our fishermen, whether that's new global markets to sell their product, whether that's being able to have control over our own waters and fairer access for our own indigenous fleet. I therefore put to you that it's not Brexit and Brexiteers are not delivering, Cabinet Secretary. It is the Scottish Government who is not delivering for our fishermen through their own political intransigence, inability to work with UK Government on this particular issue, and therefore, at this point of time, not putting in place the framework which enables us to have a fishing policy post-Brexit, post-CFP, which has currently led to a policy vacuum in Scotland, which is something that you are 100% responsible for.
Well, I just entirely accept that, disagree with the series of propositions which are entirely wrong. We've been managing fisheries for 20 years. We have very clear policies. They're debated regularly in Scotland. We meet stakeholders more regularly than anyone else, rightly so. And I entirely disagree with the set of propositions that Mr Thompson has put forward, although I'm not sure whether they're shared by all the Conservative MPs, because I believe that there are many different views amongst the Scottish Conservative MPs about these matters.
Well, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. We'll maybe get back to the Fisheries Bill with Mr Duckett.
I'm not going to talk for all Conservative MPs on the panel, but I'm pretty sure we all agree that we're all interested in the best interests of Scottish fishermen. I think we can probably all agree on that, Cabinet Secretary. However, you said a moment ago that in the withdrawal agreement there's a clear link between trade and access. You said a categorical, absolute clear link between trade and access. However, in the session before this, which you probably didn't hear, but Mr Armstrong, Bertie Armstrong, Chief Executive of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, has previously gone on record as saying that the withdrawal agreement does not cross any red lines. One of those red lines for the SFF is there must not be a link between trade and access. So, do you agree with Bertie Armstrong that the withdrawal agreement does not cross that red line?
Well, I take the view in relation to the content of the agreement that, it is a matter of incontrovertible fact that the agreement which the Prime Minister entered into with the EU links access to the UK's waters with trade. Because and I'll bring Richard in a moment just to read from the text. Because, if first of all, I'm grateful for Mr Duguid saying that we all want to work in the best interests of fishing and move away from, the pure politics of it, because that's not really what today's about. But, I do with respect think that at best it's extremely unfortunate, and at worst it makes it extremely difficult, much more difficult, the forthcoming negotiations, should they take place, about securing the best deal for Scottish fishermen, because the deal that the Prime Minister has entered into specifically says that if there is not an acceptable deal by, I think, July 2020, acceptable to the other EU members, the EU fisheries members obviously are those that have an interest here, then, and in those circumstances, the benefits of the customs union of having no tariffs will be eliminated. Eliminated only for the fisheries sector and the aquaculture sector, which I think we all accept has nothing to do with CFP whatsoever. But can I perhaps bring in, just for the sake of the record, could I bring in Mr MacLeod just to...
Well, actually, before you do that, I'll give Mr MacLeod the opportunity to respond in a second. But what you just said there about, I think you're absolutely correct. The EU have stated that in response to our red line of not allowing the EU continued and guaranteed access to our waters for fishing in the event of a non-agreement of any kind of fisheries agreement, then you're absolutely correct that they've said that we could not accept that without applying tariffs to seafood product exports. However, that's not the same as saying that we will allow them continued access in favour of a favourable trade deal. I don't want to speak for the fishing.
Can I, before we do this, just to clarify once and for all, can I read what is in the political declaration, and then we can maybe get a response to that? Because I think when everybody's interpretation is being applied here and everybody's coming to their own conclusion, what the political declaration says is, within the context of the overall economic partnership, establishment of a new fisheries agreement on inter alia access to waters and quota share to be in place in time to be used for determining fishing opportunities for the first year after the transition period. Now, I don't know about you, Cabinet Secretary, but that seems pretty clear to me that there looks like there's going to be some sort of trade-off for access to fishing waters with a trade arrangement and agreement. I don't know what your view on that is.
Well, I agree with that. I think that really is, I think it's a matter of fact. It's not really a matter for debate. Maybe I can bring in Mr. Gibb just to add his comments. Alan.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Likewise, Convener, the reading of that text is very clear in terms of interpretation. The agreement says that the discussions around access will also include discussions around trade in that point. Of course, if those discussions fail, then trade won't be linked and will be subject to tariffs and access to markets, and also, unfortunately, the aquaculture sector, which is the largest food sector, together. People may say, I know it says that, but we'll say no. Well, if they're going to say no, then you're putting at odds the aquaculture sector and the catching sector. It's very clear that the discussions will include access to waters in return for trade. How those discussions will conclude aren't clear, but it's very clear that the discussions will have that. I've been personally involved in negotiations on behalf of the Scottish Government at a high level in the EU. The colleagues that I operate with in the Commission and other Member States, their expectation is unbounded that trade will form a link to ensure they get access, and access at historic and significant levels.
Okay, thank you.
If I might just add to that as well, Convener, just to build on that point that Alan's just made. Following the EU summit on the 25th of November, the European Council, which of course represents individual member states in the EU, released a statement in which they said they would, and I quote, demonstrate particular vigilance to protecting EU fishing enterprises and to, quote, build on inter alia existing reciprocal access and quota shares. So not just maintain existing access and quota shares, but build on, which I think signals a very clear statement of intent on the part of EU member states, and I think it's possibly safe to assume individual EU member states with a particularly significant fishing interest to not just seek to maintain access and quotas, but to possibly expand existing arrangements.
Okay, I know you've got.
I just want to close this out just by saying that I think the Cabinet Secretary, I think you used the words incontrovertible fact, when in fact we've received evidence from other witnesses that actually state that the terminology is actually vague and overly vague and open to interpretation. So I propose we don't continue with this arguing what the text actually means, but we may want to ask separately. I know we're no longer in a position to seek the evidence from the industry representatives here directly, but we might want to seek their view on what they believe the text to mean.
Okay. Everybody's got an interpretation of the text, but the text is what the text is, and I don't think we can get away from that. John Lamont.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Did you watch the last evidence session that the committee had this morning? before you joined us?
No, I was engaged in other work this morning.
So we took evidence from the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, Scottish Seafood Association, RSPB Scotland, Scottish Environment Link and National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations. And amongst the evidence, they said there's a policy vacuum from the Scottish Government. They said there's no real sense of direction from the Scottish Government in terms of fishing policies. Do you agree with them?
No.
Can you explain why? And perhaps in the context of when you intend to publish your own Fisheries Bill?
Well, we already have the powers that we require for most matters, and that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, because we have devolved responsibility for fisheries, and we are coming to our 20th anniversary of exercising these powers. So we don't require to take on legislation in order to carry on the successful administration of fisheries policy in Scotland. And I would point out that, I mean, our efforts have led to considerable success in Scotland in relation to the common fisheries policy. I myself have played a part in the negotiations for the past 3 years in attending December Council in Brussels and other matters. So, I mean, I entirely refute that suggestion. I haven't had the benefit, I'm afraid, because of being engaged in other ministerial responsibilities this morning, to listen to the previous evidence. So I'm afraid I have to rely on Mr. Lamont's version of the evidence given, but we do enjoy very good relations with the stakeholders and meet regularly with them. And I would also point out that, you know, there are very real concerns about Brexit at a high level, about the loss of access to markets. That was evident when I visited Eyemouth in December and found out their concerns in relation to the export of shellfish and concerns about non-tariff barriers. That any delay to export of shellfish, which is time critical and perishable, would of course be critical. So there are different views about these matters around the country, but I entirely refute the assertions that Mr. Lamont has made, and I'm not quite sure how they relate to the Fisheries Bill, convener, which I thought I was here to discuss this morning, not trading political insults.
Well, I think you'll find it quite helpful to read Hansard in the account that was given in the evidence session this morning, which I'm sure you'll confirms the points that I've just made from the evidence session previous. So just to confirm, the Scottish Government has no plans to bring forward its own Fisheries Bill. A yes or a no would suffice.
Well, you know, we already have.
No.
It's not a yes or no answer, because you see, what you're ignoring is the fact that we already have most of the powers that all of the powers we're required to manage our fisheries. In relation to the specific question about whether, in the event that Brexit goes ahead, that we will require more powers, then of course, if it is the case that we require to legislate, then of course we will do so. And again, I've made that abundantly clear.
Cabinet Secretary,
I can also say that we are due to publish a national discussion paper on the future of fisheries management in Scotland shortly, and that has followed a long period of negotiation and engagement with stakeholders, including myself and my colleague Rosanna Cunning.
So my interpretation of what you've just said is there are no plans to bring forward a Fisheries Bill to the Scottish Parliament.
No, that's not right.
So there are plans, or they're not? Sorry, there are plans or they're not plans? You're issuing a consultation, but there's no bill.
Since Mr. Lamont doesn't seem to be getting it.
Say it once more, then we'll understand.
The powers that we require, but if we need post-Brexit to legislate, then of course we would do so if that proves to be necessary. And I can also, if the committee wishes, go into that in more technical detail with my officials should that be required.
Okay, well I don't think that's particularly clear at all. Is the Scottish Government's policy still to try and stop Brexit and retain Scotland's membership of the EU on current terms?
Well, we believe that Brexit is the wrong choice for Scotland, and indeed it's the choice that Scotland did not make. We voted against Brexit, and if it does go ahead, then we've made it absolutely clear that we believe access to the single market and continued membership of the customs union is essential. And one final point, Peter, is this, that the fisheries sector, particularly in the processing sector, but also in the catching sector, does receive the benefit of many people from the EU who choose to work in Scotland, who sustain our fisheries sector, whose input, whose work, whose commitment we appreciate. One of the adverse consequences of Brexit is the loss of free movement of people, the threat to migrant workers, the threat to EU workers, the threat to the continued availability of workers in processing. And I believe in the North East, for example, a very large number of people that work in processing plants are of non-UK EU extraction. We think they're welcome in Scotland, but I'm not quite sure what the UK government's policy is on that. And post-Brexit, the loss of free movement of people would be a very serious threat to the fisheries sector, in our view.
So you wish Scotland's fishing industry still to be subject to the same terms of the common fisheries policy which we are currently by retaining current membership of the EU?
Well, I'm sorry that Mr. Lamont didn't respond to the issue about people, which is extremely important, but turning to the common fisheries policy, I've already made clear that we've always opposed that, and we have also put forward over a year ago a clear alternative, which at the time, as I recall, wasn't taken seriously, but since it seems to have come back onto the table, at least of some Tory MPs, although I appreciate that there's many different versions of a proposed Brexit policy from various different Tory MPs, depending upon who you speak to.
Okay, right. We've got less than half an hour left, and we've got the Cabinet Secretary with us to answer questions on the Fisheries Bill and how it applies to Scotland. And I know these are all very, very important questions, and they're very ideological questions about Brexit, which we're obviously very interested and entertained with. But can we possibly stick to the Fisheries Bill? Christine?
That point, I mean, we're trying to understand why the Scottish Government are not bringing forward their own fisheries bill. This point was explored in the previous evidence session. We need to understand what the Scottish Government's policy is around fishing, why they're not bringing forward their own fisheries bill, and this is why these policies need to be bottled out.
Okay, well, yeah, and that's legitimate. We've heard the Cabinet Secretary already on that particular issue. I don't know if you've got anything further to add on that, or shall we move on?
I think with respect, I have answered that question. And of course, Convener, if there's any technical questions, we're very happy to follow up very quickly with written confirmation.
I think that would be very helpful. I know you've got your two officials taking notes and making sure that will be available to us, so we're grateful to that, so we can better understand what your approach will be for the future. Christine here.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I agree with Ross Thompson when he said that the fishing industry is absolutely one of the winners of Brexit, but the expansion of that industry, as we heard this morning, will need support. And there was support within the UK government budget recently, and I just wondered when there may be some detail of what support the Scottish Government will be able to provide the industry so that they can capitalise on the additional landings.
Well, if the member is referring to the funding from EMFF, that's the European Maritime Fisheries Fund, then I agree that that has been funding that's been extremely useful to Scotland and Scottish fisheries sector. And of course it's been funding that we've come to expect from the EU and to accept as part of the EU overall funding package. And we have benefited in respect to processing companies of ports and harbours, of vessels, scientific research and improvement, technical facilities of monitoring and improving the surveillance and overall sustainability of fisheries. So that funding, I agree with the member, has been absolutely essential. I have met regularly with Mr Gove and Mr Eustace at the UK Government Devolved Administration meetings over the past 2 years, including Mrs Ledson actually before Michael Gove. And I have been pressing over those 2 years, or since the Brexit referendum really, for confirmation that post-Brexit there would be a replacement, a son of EMF. And it was a relief that eventually, just before Christmas, there was a recognition from Mr Gove that this must be the case. So I'm pleased about that. But unfortunately the announcement that was made is defective in some of the technical detail and in relation to the availability of finance. And our officials have had, unfortunately, they weren't cited on the announcement by Mr Gove before he made it, otherwise we could have made sure that the technical deficiencies were corrected. Now, either, Convener, I can go into these now with my officials, or I can write to you on this matter. But we are agreed, I think, Ms Hare and myself, that funding is essential going forward, and the Scottish Government has always played its part, but we have been reliant on EU funding, which has been guaranteed as part of the overall package of EU membership. The future, post-Brexit, post-222, is far from clear.
I'll just make one final. Thank you for that answer. But with respect, when you take back control of power around policy around fisheries, which you're quite happy to do, you obviously have to take that financial responsibility as well. And when we had this panel in front of us earlier, they had used phrases like you needed to get your skates on, there needed to be detail as soon as possible as to what type of support you would be able to offer them and what that might look like, and that hasn't been forthcoming yet. So that's obviously again from our stakeholders, and I would reiterate the point that John Laminate had mentioned earlier, that perhaps reading the Hansard copy of that previous session would be incredibly helpful for you.
Well, if you'd say in response to that, I'm acutely aware of the importance of the need for funding. And the point is that the funding has been guaranteed from Europe, but it hasn't been guaranteed by the UK government. I mean, that's just a matter of fact. Now, I mean, if we lose the EU funding from Brexit, and we will, then that is money that the Scottish Government hasn't possessed. It's come from the EU, so that needs to be replaced. Now, one of the amendments, Convener, going back to the Fisheries Bill, and referring to my lecture 4th of December, was that I proposed that the amendment insert a new clause after clause 30 to require the Secretary of State to make available to Scottish ministers sums which are at least equivalent to the sums made available to the Scottish ministers under the EMFF in the year prior to exit date. So, we have some thought, and I have raised this point firmly, respectfully, but clearly at every meeting that I've had with the UK government, that the EU has provided funding for fisheries, for farming, for rural development, and it's up to the UK government to replace that. After all, those were the promises that were made during the referendum, that there would be at least matched funding, if not more. And, Mr Eustace himself made that promise. So, with respect, I do think it is for the UK government to fulfil that promise. And they could do so by accepting the amendment. Maybe Ms Hare could say whether she approves of our amendment.
Okay, maybe not an opportunity for that, but we'll move on now to Mr Duckett.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just before I go on to the question I was going to ask, just a little bit on the funding. You mentioned that the EMFF, or the EU funding, was guaranteed, but is it not the case that that's only guaranteed up until the end of the current EU budget cycle?
Yes, but they're in the process of agreeing the funding for the next cycle.
Okay. But then, of course,
a 7-year cycle. Yes, you're absolutely right. But there's no doubt there will be a next funding cycle. And I've attended the December Council meeting. I can assure you that all the fisheries countries are absolutely vigilant in insisting that there is a continuance of this funding, and there will be. I don't think there's any question about that. So the scenario is that, with continued EU membership, we would have, or we may, depending on what happens in Brexit, still enjoy the benefit of that very clearly defined set of policies which have operated well, which have served, I think, by and large, the fishing sector well, with, frankly, a lack of clarity. The UK started off by talking about a UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and the only thing we knew about that were the words UK Shared Prosperity Fund. They didn't say how much it was, what it would be for, when it will kick in, and over what period. The EU's funding is over a 7-year period. It's being discussed at the moment, and having taken part in some of those discussions, I can assure Mr Duguid, and I know he personally wishes to be cooperative, I appreciate that in his approach to things, that I can assure you that there will be similar funding available to EU countries under their policies. But the question really is, what is the UK's policy post-Brexit? Not just up to 222, but post-Brexit, if that goes ahead.
Okay, thanks for that response. And as the Cabinet Secretary is probably aware, I've I've been a strong advocate of making sure that or sort of a similar form of funding is replaced, not least for my own constituents in Banff and Buchan. So we can agree on that. But however, when I first, going back to the Fisheries Bill itself, which the only copy I've got is on my phone here, so forgive me for referring to my phone. When I first viewed the bill, I was a little concerned that in clause 28, I think it starts talking about funding mechanisms for the Welsh Assembly and the Northern Ireland Assembly, where there to be one, or the Northern Ireland Department for the moment. And I was a bit concerned that there was nothing in there specifically about Scottish funding, as you can imagine, as I'm sure you were as well. But the response I received from the Minister was that input to the bill was sought from the devolved administrations of what they would want to see in it, and there was no mechanism for funding. So in slight shades of what we're hearing has happened with the Agricultural Bill, I maybe should add that there wasn't a specific request from the Scottish Government to have a clause in there to have a mechanism for funding, and that there would be a separate Scottish Fisheries Bill. So at the risk of repeating Mr Lamon's question, would such a Fisheries Bill from the Scottish Government apply that funding, and if so, when are we going to see evidence of that?
Well, first of all, I refer back to my letter of the 4th December, and I don't know whether the member has seen it, but I'm very happy to share it if the committee doesn't already have it. There's nothing secret about it, but I've read from it that we have proposed in this bill a specific amendment that specifically deals with an obligation on the UK government post-Brexit to provide funding at least equivalent to the sums made available under the EMFF. And the point really is that this is money that the Scottish government budget does not have unless it gets it from a third party. That third party up till now has been the EU.
Which won't be
in terms of funding, in terms of the CFP, we're not happy with the CFP. We've discussed that. But in terms of funding, I think it's been a fair friend to the rural economy and fishing industry, and therefore we've had that funding from a third party. So if Ms Hare says that somehow we've got to replace that funding from the rest of our block funding, which is intended entirely for different purposes, then what then is being suggested is cuts to public services in Scotland in other ways. Plainly, that third-party funding needs to be replaced for the UK government, who advocated, or some of whom advocated Brexit, and we, in this bill, asked for a specific legal obligation on the UK government to do what the EU formerly did. I think that's absolutely clear and absolutely the correct approach.
So if you wanted, as I would expect the industry would want, for that funding mechanism, for that funding to be made available from the UK government, as you describe as a third party, then why didn't you request that to be on the face of the bill in the beginning, rather than bring it in as an amendment later?
No. I've always made it absolutely clear, time and time again, and in the numerous meetings that we've had every 2 or 3 months with Mr Gove and Mr Eustace, that it's up to the UK government to replace the EU funding in principle for the rural economy, and specifically for the EMFF. I've argued that time and time again, face to face, eyeball to eyeball with Mr Gove and Mr Eustace. They're well aware of that. I could have put it more clearly, politely, firmly, but clearly at numerous meetings. And we've asked for it to be included in the bill. And so far, as I say, Mr Duguid, we haven't had a formal response to the letter of the 4th of December, which is a non-political, closely argued, detailed, comprehensive letter setting out the specific amendments that we would like to see in the Fisheries Bill. And, with respect to Convener, I think the purpose of this meeting, I hope, discussion, I hope, is to try to make progress, to see what progress we can make. I'm hopeful that we could. Inclusion of our amendment to this bill would, I think, amount to progress. Lastly, and contrary to what the DEFRA Minister of State has said, we do in Scotland have powers to make grants and set charges through previous legislation, which wasn't replicated in England. And again, Convener, I will ask my officials after this meeting to write you, to give you chapter and verse of the legislative provisions under which we have those precise powers.
Okay, thank you for that. We will be talking to the Minister, George Eustace, later today as well, so we'll know to ask him the same question. But going on to, as you say, making progress, the next question I'd like to ask is, will the requirements to produce a joint fisheries statement provide enough flexibility, in your opinion, for the Scottish Government to pursue its own fishery policies post-Brexit?
Well, what we're concerned about is the overall impact of the Fisheries Bill, and at present we are able to manage our fisheries, and our concerns relate specifically to the powers that would be taken in terms of sections 18 to 20. There are other concerns, and they're set out in my letter, but the specific concerns about quota setting are ones which we put very clearly. We haven't yet resolved, and I do hope, quite sincerely, Convener, we can resolve these, because we have made, we have made progress in other respects in the bill, and I wanted to emphasise that. The approach to these meetings is to try to use them to make progress, not really to trade points or insults or anything like that. And I have a good working relationship with Mr. Eustace in particular, who I've dealt with for quite a long time. So I am hoping we can make progress, but we do believe we have the powers that we need. And to repeat, if post-Brexit, if it ever becomes clear what's happening in the kind of Brexit bureau, then if we need legislation, of course we will so legislate. And again, Convener, we will write to you and set out the technical detail of that, so that there is no dubiety whatsoever about the Scottish Government position.
Thank you. So again, you didn't really answer the question, but you did refer to Clause 18 and the Secretary of State's power to determine fishing opportunities. To repeat my question again, does the requirement to produce a joint fisheries statement provide enough flexibility for the Scottish Government and yourself as the Cabinet Secretary? And are you also satisfied that Clause 19, which states that, sorry, it's a very small text here, but before making or withdrawing a determination under Section 18, the Secretary of State must consult with Scottish ministers? Are you satisfied with that clause?
Well, we recognise that we have made some progress in the bill, but the powers that set out in the bill would allow the Secretary of State, for example, to set quotas for, say, ordinary crab, or effort limits for the Shetland lobster fishery. And this, in my view, would impact and devolved interests. And if Mr. Eustace, and he may well say this if you ask him, Mr. Duggan, I'm sure you will, if he says, well, I have no intention of doing that, well, that's fine. But you see, this is legislation. Verbal assurances aren't really enough. If the UK Minister has no plans to use these powers, and I suspect he hasn't, then why is he taking the powers in the first place? Now, I mean, under the 1967 Sea Fisheries Conservation Act, I can already set de facto limits on efforts and quota under Section 5, and we do disagree in respect to the technicalities with the UK Government that the relevant clauses in the bill relate to reserved matter. Their argument essentially is that the conduct of international relations is reserved, and that's true, but our response is, and we haven't had an answer to this incidentally, is that the implementation of international obligations is something which is devolved. And the reason for that is the wording in the Scotland Act 1998. It explicitly excludes the implementation and observation of international agreements from that reservation. It specifically excludes it. That means that it's excluded from the reservation, so de facto it is devolved.
Okay.
Now, why the UK Government don't recognise that and will provide all the detail, because you probably know I'm a lawyer, so I'm perhaps starting to speak like a lawyer and as a politician, which is probably a welcome change for many. But it's absolutely crystal clear that our interpretation accords with the only correct interpretation of the law. And that's where we stand. If we can resolve that issue, Mr. Duggan, and I hope we can, then I think we can make further progress.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to,
very
it's very important to clarify this.
Questions people want to come in.
Okay, so I think this could be helpful, but I think you mentioned that verbal assurances, and I've received lots of verbal assurances. I receive verbal assurances on a daily basis, and they're very reassuring, which is their purpose. But you're right, they're not, if it's not on the face of the bill, it's not binding. But I'll bring you back to clause 19, where it says, before making or withdrawing a determination under section 18, the Secretary of State must consult the Scottish ministers. And specifically on the subject of Orkney crab, I specifically asked Mr Eustace about that. And his words, again, verbal reassurance was, well, of course, that would come right down to the Cabinet Secretary in Scotland to decide. That's just a verbal. So my question is, if clause 19 is not satisfactory, what, and this might be something you want to consider with your officials and submit in writing, is, and it may already be in this December, the 4th letter, but could you just confirm whether or not clause 19 is satisfactory in your opinion?
Well, I suppose that, to answer shortly, the problem is that an obligation, a legal obligation on a minister to consult means that all the minister has to do is send us a letter. Then he has discharged that obligation of consultation. What we require is consent. And that is what, with respect, Mr Duguid, that's the nub of the disagreement. And we have, in fairness to ourselves, set this out in detail and in principle in our letter of the 4th of December. So I hope that the difference between consult and the obligation to obtain consent is a simple one and it's clearly understood.
That I'll have to do. Hugh Gaffney.
Cabinet Secretary, morning. This might be an interesting one. How do you envisage any disagreements between governments when preparing the joint fisheries statement being managed?
Well, we do, as I've said, Mr Gaffney, work closely together, and we try to resolve disagreements, firstly through discussion. And to be fair, I want to emphasise this. I've worked reasonably well with Mr Eustace in the December councils, certainly in 2016 and 17. He wasn't at the last December council. I think he was tied up actually in your fisheries bill. But so we work well together. Our fisheries officials probably work more with their counterparts in the UK than any other officials because of the need to attend meetings in Norway and the Faroes and Brussels, so they have more interchange, So it's human nature, isn't it? When you spend more time with people, you tend to try to build up a relationship, and I think that's a good thing. But it's not a glee club here. And I want just to make several points that it has been, despite that cordial working relationship, it has been difficult for us to secure the outcomes that I believe were fair for Scotland. For example, we should have had a concordat set in place. For example, the UK didn't pursue our interests in the Norway negotiations in respect of certain species, including blue whiting. For example, we have lost out quite substantially in respect of a species called Arctic cod. And therefore, I can mention all of this in more detail, and I appreciate, Mr Gaffney, that's not your particular question. But what I'm saying is that it's not easy to get the UK government to listen to the Scottish case, and it's certainly very difficult to get them to deliver what we, in some cases, believe is the fair and the right outcome. Therefore, I think that I'm grateful to have the opportunity to put that point on the record.
Well, on that basis then, if they feel that that's the way it's going, would you support calls from the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations for there to be a dispute resolution mechanism set out in the bill? Would this be helpful?
Well, I think there are various mechanisms to sort out disputes between the Scottish and the UK government, and I have to say I'm not sure that we've ever found that they work particularly well.
So therefore, if we added that into the bill, would it help? If the mechanism was there to help,
our experience in resolving disputes with the UK government has, I wouldn't say it's been a consistent tale of woe, but not far short.
Did you, Brock?
Thank you, Chair. Mr Duguid's already asked a question I was going to ask around quotas. So I suppose all of this comes down to, in the end, Cabinet Secretary, whether or not the UK government can be trusted to deliver on behalf of Scottish fishers' interests and indeed to look after those interests. And I wonder, you started mentioning some of the historic examples where the UK government's been found wanting in that regard, and which might have given rise to those misgivings. I wonder perhaps if you could share some further details with us on that.
Well, yes, and I want to emphasise to Deirdre Brock and to other members that we do try to be cooperative at all times, but there have been ways in which we believe that they have failed to protect Scotland's fishing interests. I mean, for example, despite a revised fisheries concordat being agreed between the four ministers in August 2016, more than 2 years ago, the UK has delayed publication of the concordat to the detriment of Scotland. For example, because of the way the UK government distributes hake preference quota, mainly benefiting fishermen in the northeast of England, Scotland lost out on a total of 1,129 tonnes of whiting quota with a value of 1.2 million over the last 5 years. For example, in the EU-Norway negotiations, the UK has regularly voted for a swap package disadvantaging Scotland quite considerably, actually. For example, in 2017, Scotland forfeited over 20,000 tonnes of blue whiting in relation to Arctic cod swaps worth around 4 million, but gained no benefit, not even a single kilo of Arctic cod that came back. Now, these are just examples, I think, of difficulties that we've had, but they don't detract from the fact that we do approach our relations with a workmanlike desire to try to cooperate and get the best results. My personal view is that the decisions are very often made by the UK Treasury or by Number 10 Downing Street, and to some extent perhaps individual fisheries minister. I don't want to damn Mr Eustace's reputation by praising him, but he may want to do something, but perhaps his hands may be tied by higher powers.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Jed Killen.
Thank you.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. My question on the Secretary of State's powers to set catch and effort quota has been covered, but I just wanted to follow up with some evidence that we had in the previous session from the Chief Executive of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. He spoke about the risk of recreating elements of the Common Fisheries Policy in terms of the difficulty of having people in different places trying to agree to the same thing. Do you think there's a danger of that being replicated in terms of the consultation and consent that you're talking about when it comes to catch and effort quotas?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think there's probably a fair amount of common ground in respect of these matters. And, my view is very, very clear. Sustainable fisheries must be based on the science. TAC, total allowable catch, is the internationally accepted way of setting the maximum limit of catch of any one species. That's governed by the science. And then we need to have management of fisheries as locally as possible, with those who are carrying out the fishing having an absolute say in how that is done, and working with conservation interests and scientists. I don't think there's really any doubt about that. So I personally don't think that there's a risk that or anything arising therefrom should necessarily complicate that in any way. And for my part, I would certainly, I don't know whether you've lost the light here.
We have.
We've lost light at this end, but and I think we've lost sound as well, actually. I don't know whether you can still hear us, so I'll just plough on anyway. But
Cabinet Secretary, can you hear us? We're back.
You're back.
Oh, right.
And you can hear us all right.
I'm back. I'm back.
Yes, you are. Reassuring as it is. Yes, thank you.
Somebody said that once.
Mr. Killen.
No, sorry, just carry on. I'm happy with that.
Could Mr Gibb maybe add to that, because he deals with this on a daily basis? Alan.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Yes, on a daily basis, the evolution is well understood between the four administrations. It's very different to, I think, what Mr Armstrong was alluding to in terms of 27 member states trying to come together with a compromise. We already have a structure in place how the quota is allocated through administrations that governments are currently all of us are committed to. Very straightforward. I think I'm surprised to hear Mr Armstrong's comments. He's also on record as saying that he's served by Scottish Government. His service that he gets in terms of consultation, engagement, information is surpassed by nobody across the European Union, far less the UK. And it's a very well understood system, very commonly used system, and I think perhaps more importantly, the fishing industry in England is night and day different to the fishing industry in Scotland in terms of the type of managers that needed, the expertise where it's located, and it's right and proper that we carry on as we are. And the vast majority of industry that I deal with are very supportive of that.
Thank you. And just lastly, because we are running out of time, I just want to briefly, and it'll have to be very briefly, Cabinet Secretary, touch on the sea fish levy. I know that this is very similar to the issues that we had around the red meat levy, where the government accepted the amendment to have this devolved. Why do you feel that this is necessary, and how would this assist you, and what representations are you making to have this devolved?
Well, we set out our arguments very clearly in our letter of the 4th of December, and a series of amendments were proposed by us, namely allowing the Scottish sector to benefit more directly and fully from the levy, and to evolve and improve transparency on the use of the levy. I commend my letter of 4th of December. We are waiting for a response. Yeah. I hope that just as in aquaculture, in the red meat levy, I hope that we can make progress on the sea fish levy as well.
Thank you. And we will be putting that to Minister Eustace this afternoon. We'll see if we could get you a reply to your letter of the 4th of December, given the amount of references that you've made to it in the course of this exchange. But Cabinet Secretary, is always very grateful for your time and your contribution here this morning to help us out with this short inquiry into the Fisheries Bill. If there's anything else, I think you said that you'll supply us with a number of other bits of documentation and information, so we look forward to receiving them from you. But thank you once again. Order, order.